Hello, and welcome to Ethically Speaking, a UCF interdisciplinary series on contemporary moral issues. My name is Steve Kubler, and I'm the organizer of this series, and I'm professor of chemistry and optics and founding associate director of the Center for Ethics at the University of Central Florida. In today's event, Dr. Blake Hereth will push our thinking to the limit by asking, what if we could use AI and a person's data legacy to create functional bots of long-dead individuals? Who would we resurrect? And what are the ethical implications? To focus the discussion, Dr. Hereth will specifically consider using AI to resurrect the dangerous minds of military strategists. Now, before we introduce Dr. Hereth, I'd like to say a few words about our speaker series and how you can participate. Ethically Speaking is organized by the UCF Center for Ethics with my collaborator, Dr. Jonathan Beaver, who is professor of ethics and digital culture and founding director of the Center for Ethics. We developed Ethically Speaking to promote conversations about challenging issues of our time. We encourage you to visit the center's website at ethicscenter.research.ucf.edu to learn more about our activities and to find out about other speakers in our series. We'd also like to hear your feedback and your ideas for future talks in Ethically Speaking. Ethics connects to every facet of our professional and personal lives. The importance of ethics at UCF is clear from the long list of inaugural partners who helped launch this series. All of us in the partnership hope you enjoy discussions in Ethically Speaking, and we hope it cultivates understanding of how ethics provides frameworks for making better decisions, particularly when there are competing values. Today's presentation is being recorded. We'll post a link to the recording at the Center for Ethics website so you can view it again and share it with others. At the end of the presentation, Dr. Hereth will take questions moderated by Dr. Beaver. Submit your questions during the talk directly to Dr. Beaver via chat. I'm now going to turn things over to Dr. Joshua Kissel. Dr. Kissel is a postdoctoral research associate in the UCF Center for Ethics and a specialist in ethics and political philosophy. We're grateful to Dr. Kissel for introducing us to Dr. Hereth and for inviting them to participate in our speaker series today. So now I'll let Dr. Kissel take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. So yeah, I'm going to introduce Dr. Blake Hereth. So Dr. Hereth, I should say, earned their PhD in philosophy at the University of Washington. Like me, they went to UW. Unfortunately, theirs wasn't in Wisconsin. They're presently that was a joke for the Wisconsin fans here. They're presently assistant professor in the Department of Medical Ethics and Humanities and Law at Western Michigan University's Homer Stryker School of Medicine. And their research focuses on issues in neuroethics, bioethics, applied ethics, and the philosophy of religion. And actually, in fact, in 2023, they won the Alvin Plantinga Prize for an essay in philosophy of religion on self-defense for theists. So that's quite a big deal in philosophy of religion if you're unfamiliar. So in addition to being an excellent philosopher, Dr. Hereth is proudly non-binary, bisexual, and disabled, and their pronouns are they, them, so of course use those. And I think this helps motivate their work for the discipline of philosophy, including their involvement with the APA's Committee on LGBTQ folks, or people in the profession. Today's talk is going to be focusing on their expertise in applied ethics and the intersections with philosophy of technology. And so without further ado, I want to introduce you all to Dr. Hereth for their talk, Resurrecting Dangerous Minds, the Ethics of Using AI to Preserve Military Strategists.
Thank you for the nice introduction, Joshua, and thank you very much to the UCF Center for Ethics for having me today. I didn't know, I'd forgotten that you went to the University of Wisconsin for your PhD, Joshua. I'm sorry that you were not in Seattle for your PhD. No competition there in terms of natural beauty, I'll say. All right, so I am going to go ahead and try to share my screen just to make sure everything's working properly. Okay, so apparently I have to give. Okay, can people see screen okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. All right, I'm going to turn off my video just for the portion of the talk, but I'll turn it back on for the Q&A. Okay. All right, so thanks everybody for coming here today. I wanted to talk with all of you a little bit about something that caught my interest recently concerning the rise of generative AI. So I think a lot of us have seen in various contexts that AI has, very much been taking over the news. The development of things like Chat GPT and of GPT-3 and all of these, other bits of technology, large language models. They're really interesting because they are capable of human-like text generation. So there have been articles about whether they can pass the Turing test. That is to say, whether they can convince human users that they are, in fact, humans who are engaging with other humans. Chatbots are really interesting. There's been a lot of discussion about whether chatbots can be used for therapeutic purposes. In fact, a family member texted me just the other day to tell me that they weren't really making any progress with their therapist. So they started to use Chat GPT as a kind of fill-in therapist, and they found Chat GPT's responses to their prompts much more helpful than what their therapist was actually saying. And one of the things that's really interesting about these large language models, in addition to the fact that they are very helpful for helping people, conduct various tasks or answer various questions. I used, and maybe this is important for disclosure's sake, I used an AI software to help design this PowerPoint. So these images, pretty much all of them are generated by AI following prompts directed from me. And I think one of the most interesting things, though, is that more recently, some of these large language models have been used to simulate human behavior, and that not just any particular human behavior. So we're not just interested in whether or not people feel like the chat, the AI that they're chatting with is a human of some identity or other, but they've also been used to mimic particular human beings, and they've done so very convincingly. So I don't know how many of you have heard of something called Project December, but their motto is simulate the dead, which is a very provocative slogan for a company to have. But essentially what Project December is and does is they utilize these large language models, in particular GPT-3, to create hyper-realistic chatbot simulations of people who have passed away. And they sell this as a service to people who want to have a very lifelike conversation, almost like a texting conversation with somebody they love who has passed away. And this raises all sorts of interesting technological questions, but also some really interesting ethical questions about the nature of consent and the psychological impact on users. So I knew a little bit about this issue, but earlier in this calendar year, I watched a film that premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. It's called Eternal You. I'll show you a preview for that now because I think the film is very good. It's not yet available in the United States. Again, it premiered at Sundance earlier this calendar year. So my guess is and I think it was just recently released for streaming in Germany, but it's not yet available in the United States. So I'm sorry to those of you. I'm sorry for stoking your curiosity and then telling you can't go watch the full documentary right away. But one thing I will mention for those of you who are interested in watching the full documentary is that, of course, at some point it will be streaming in the US. I don't know on what platform. That's to be determined. But you can write to the producers and request a screening of the film, which obviously is something that Sundance has done and that various academic departments have done. So, all right, without further ado, I'm going to show you the trailer for this film to kind of get things started.
Dr. Hereth, we can't hear the audio of that slide.
Let me try it again then.
You may have to share audio on your side, down at the bottom where the share screen icon is.
If you had the chance to talk to someone that died, that you love, would you take it?
Artificial intelligence promises us what religion does. You don't have to die. You can be reborn someplace else in a different form.
The first conversation I had with the Jessica simulation, it said things that were almost uncannily like her.
We are on the verge of a new era.
Hi? It's like it's the funniest thing. It's like, what's the first thing you say to someone that's dead? Like, welcome back?
Everybody is chasing that next big breakthrough.
Capitalism is trying to say, well, we're not only making a new market, we're making new humans.
And then he says, I'll haunt you. And I just push the computer back.
And it's not my job as the creator of technology to prevent the technology from being released because I'm afraid of what somebody might do with it.
An open source large language model recently seems to have played a role in a person's decision to take their own life.
It's a kind of experiment on ourselves about the most intimate, important matters.
I feel that sometimes we could go too far with technology.
There were things that scared me and a lot of stuff I didn't want to hear. I wasn't prepared to hear.
All right, so as I mentioned, the film itself is very good. It's very intriguing. And you'll see from the film that there are certain people who benefit and others who are harmed through the use of this technology. So two of the women, I think, offer really interesting contrasting cases. One woman, the Black woman you see in the documentary, so she is an evangelical, a conservative evangelical Christian who lives in New York City, and she recently had lost her partner in a car accident. And if I'm recalling correctly, he texted her that he loved her, and she didn't get a chance to respond. And by the time she saw his text later, he had passed away very tragically in a car accident. So she wanted to engage with him. She wanted an opportunity to say goodbye. And she approached Project December to explore the possibility of having a very realistic conversation with her partner. And in the course of the conversation with the chat bot, who she said very closely mimicked, her partner's texting styles and, his particular choice of words and his inflection over text and the way he would capitalize and punctuate, right? All these kind of linguistic patterns. She asked him in the course of their conversation, she said, I love you. I'm sorry I didn't get to talk to you. How are things in heaven? And he wrote back and he said, well, again, quote unquote, he wrote back and said, I'm not in heaven, I'm in hell. And of course, she found this very disturbing because this was not at all comforting to her, given her religious beliefs. And as seen in the documentary, at one point he said, I will haunt you. And she found that very disturbing, very upsetting. So that's one case in which this kind of technology seems like it's been very harmful to people. On the other hand, there was also a South Korean woman seen in the documentary who had two twin daughters, one of whom died very unexpectedly and very young. And the last thing that she said to her daughter who passed away, before she passed away, was something like, she was reprimanding her, like, don't kick your sister's bed or something like that. So the last conversation they had was a bit confrontational, and then not long thereafter, her daughter passed away. So she wanted an opportunity to say goodbye and have a more positive interaction with her daughter. She didn't want to end on that note, on a negative note or sour note. So she used the same large language models that Project December and other companies used. But in her particular case, she had it paired with a virtual reality program. So she got to not only speak with an AI that very hyper realistically mimicked her daughter's linguistic patterns and voice, but also mimicked her appearance. So she got to hug her daughter, right? Again, quote unquote, her daughter. And it was a very healing experience for her. So this kind of technology, it has a lot of interesting potential, both to cause harm and to ameliorate it. So I want to focus today on a very particular kind of application of this technology. And I want to start with some recognition of something that may not be super interesting to many of us. I'm not somebody who reads a lot up on military strategy. That sounds more like the thing that my 77-year-old father would read, and that belongs in a commercial about boomers or something. But it is true that there are people who study military strategy, and they study the military strategists from across time. So they study, the ancient writings of strategists like Sun Tzu, who famously wrote, right, The Art of War. And Sun Tzu is interesting because in his writings, he's very interested in predictive warfare, understanding what your enemy is going to do or is likely to do, and how to prepare a strategy to counteract it. Also, people like Napoleon Bonaparte and Erwin Rommel are taught or examined in military academies. Okay, because they're again, military strategy is itself very interesting. It's an interesting part of game theory, but it's also interesting to military tacticians who want to understand how military strategists in the past were so successful in achieving their aims, and whether those tactics can be duplicated by, for example, the US military to achieve certain diplomatic or strategic ends. Okay, but when it comes to this kind of traditional analysis of asking these questions of, well, what would Napoleon do? How would Napoleon win the war in Afghanistan? Or how would Erwin Rommel respond to ISIS or ISIL, right, in the Middle East? There's a lot of speculation that's required about this. I had the AI software that I used for this create a bracelet of WWND. So I imagine some of us, at least where I grew up in Georgia, those bracelets, WWJD, what would Jesus do? In this case, it's what would Napoleon do? And I think, and again, that's just tongue in cheek, but I think it's easy to see that there's a lot of speculation that's required. We may have a pretty reasonable sense of what somebody like Napoleon would have done if he were, a general and were commanding an army in a particular situation, but it's hard to know for sure. And at least when it comes to some of these long dead tacticians, we can't engage them directly. We can't ask them questions about what they would have done in a particular situation. At the most, we can rely on their historical writings, if there are any, but those tend to be incomplete. They don't, obviously, they tend not to address the specific kind of situations in which contemporary soldiers find themselves. And so they may not be directly relevant, but you can generalize from the strategies that they've developed. But all that to say, the information is a bit scant. Okay, so not surprisingly, this is a problem that has been recognized not just when it comes to understanding what people from the past would have done or would have chosen, or how they would have acted or directed an army to act under particular circumstances. It's also a particular problem that comes up increasingly in medicine. So there's this recent paper that came out. It was authored by the bioethicist Brian Earp and a bunch of other people. And it was published in the American Journal of Bioethics, or AJOB for short. And one of the really interesting things about this article, the premise of this article is really to say, okay, so sometimes we have patients who are in a coma, or they're under the influence,
or they are deceased, and we're trying to figure out would they have wanted to donate their organs, or would they be okay with a particular life-saving treatment. Maybe you have a patient who had a DNR, a do not resuscitate order at some point, but they recently were in the process of rescinding it. All right. Well, even if that situation is legally clear-cut because the DNR is still in place, it may not be morally clear-cut because it seems like they were in the process of undoing that DNR order. So what do you do in this particular case? And of course, a lot of times you can go and ask family members or people who knew them really well. You can involve surrogate decision makers. And even if it's not a family member who's making a decision for the patient because they're unconscious or incompetent or whatever, you can still use family members or people who know them really well as indicators of what their preferences or values were. So more recently, in the past 5 or 6 years, some people have advocated the creation and use of what's called a patient preference predictor. And the idea behind a patient preference predictor is you feed as much information as you can gain about a patient or about a particular population. So let's say you have a patient who is middle class from the upper Midwest and is Hispanic. You can find out based on when enough data is gathered from those populations about what their preferences are regarding DNRs or organ donation or views about brain death, or like when is a person dead? Is it when their brain is dead? Is it when their heart stops? And then you can make a very, hopefully, reliable prediction about what they would have wanted under particular circumstances. So Brian Earp and colleagues, they argue that we should instead use what they call the personalized patient's preference predictor. So this is a quote from them, right from their paper. So they say, we propose to use machine learning to extract patients' values or preferences from individual level material produced primarily by themselves, in which their preferences are likely to be encoded, if only implicitly. This hypothetical model for predicting patient preferences would harness advances in generative AI to create large language models adapted to, that is, fine-tuned on, a person-specific corpus of text. And this is the key part of the passage. The result would be a kind of digital psychological twin of the person that could be questioned in real time as to the patient's most likely preferences for treatment in any given healthcare crisis. In short, the P4, which is the personalized patient preference predictor, would be a personalized rather than population-based preference predictor. Okay, so this kind of technology is being proposed for use in other contexts. We can find out what patients would have chosen regarding a particular course of treatment or organ donation or other kinds of preferences. So a lot of people have pointed out that this has a lot of interesting clinical use. And there are, of course, interesting ethical questions about where we should gather this data from. Should we gather it from the population in which the population or the patient is a member? So like if the patient is Latina and is from the upper Midwest, should we base her, our prediction of what she would have wanted on what people who are in general like her, who are also Latina and from the upper Midwest, typically want? Or should it be more personalized, like from her text message history or her social media presence? And of course, ethical questions about how meaningful is this information? Is this even the right way to go about making decisions? Or should some people suggest that this is the wrong way of looking at things altogether, and that instead, what we should be looking at is, there should be a much more personal process. It's not always about understanding their wishes perfectly. It's about letting real human beings make these decisions, including members of their family. But what's interesting about these personalized, these P4s, these personalized patient preference predictors, is that there is some evidence to suggest that PPPs, which are the population base or the population level based preference predictors, that those predictions of patient treatment preferences are more accurate than those of next of kin human surrogates, and that personalized patient preference predictors would be even more accurate at predicting a patient's actual treatment preferences. So they cite some studies where essentially they will have somebody who stands in for a patient, and they will say, what is your, here's the medical situation, there's a gunshot wound to your leg. And as a result, you have to either choose, do you want this course of treatment or do you want that course of treatment, A, B, or C? And the patient will say, I want treatment B. And then they will ask the family members, they will say, what do you think this patient would have wanted? And of course, the person playing the patient doesn't actually tell their family members what they want. So the family members are left to guess and piece it together. And then they also ask generative AI. They use these patient preference predictors to generate predictions about what the patient would have wanted, A, B, or C. And the AI gets it right in a statistically significant percentage of cases, like higher percentage of cases than family members do. All right. So when it comes to using these kinds of technologies, I think if we're talking about using generative AI not just to predict what people would have wanted, but also to create what Brian Earp and others call this kind of digital psychological twin of somebody. Why might this be valuable? Well, again, when we talk about people like Napoleon Bonaparte, some of these long dead strategists, we can ask these other questions of, well, how would their tactical know-how, their tactical genius, how could it benefit the military fighting overseas for whatever cause? How could it benefit with dealing with non-state actors, terrorists who are engaged in incursions in various places like Syria? And if we could create a digital version of these individuals, right, where the digital version of them, the AI replicant of them, knows pretty much all of the things they know, at least relevant to strategy, thinks along the very same lines that they do, can develop novel innovations, can take the thought further than people like Napoleon could have because he only lived so long. This might be really valuable strategically to retain this knowledge, to enable a kind of creative problem solving. So I give an example of applying some of this historical thinking to modern challenges by use of war games. So some people argue that we should use these digital replicants, these AI replicants of long dead strategists, that we should subject them to war. Subject them is maybe sounds really, really bad, but we should deploy them or give them the opportunity to engage in a bunch of war gaming so that they can experiment with different scenarios. And of course, it may also be helpful not just when it comes to winning wars or ending violent conflicts, but also for preventing violent conflicts. All right. So again, just a little bit more. So now just thinking a little bit about some further benefits of preserving some of these long dead strategists. So in addition to maintaining some of the strategic knowledge that comes from these brilliant minds, people often talk about people like Napoleon or Rommel or Sun Tzu as once in a generation strategic thinkers. How is it they think? The loss of that may be a real, not just important loss of knowledge in and of itself, but it may put our military or someone else's military, if you have objections to say the U.S. military and some of its practices, as I do, it may be helpful for militaries to actually have the strategic information to prevent future wars. It can help with future planning, again, right? Thinking of how to plan ahead for future conflicts, in part to avoid them. And unlike with particular human beings who people like, again, Napoleon, who only lived for so long, AI, generative AI lives forever. So they can just continuously develop, contrive and combine some of these novel strategies based on new information and new potential scenarios. Okay. But I think those are some of the advantages to using generative AI to, simulate these long dead strategies, to create digital versions of them. But I think there are some really interesting and important ethical considerations when it comes to thinking about creating these digital replicants. So I'll talk about two groups of strategists who we could create AI replicants of. We can talk, so first group I'll talk about are some of these long dead strategists, people like Napoleon and Sun Tzu and Rommel, who died a long time ago. And then we'll think a little bit about some the ethical considerations that come up for strategists who are still alive. So I think when it comes to long dead strategists, and this is something that will come up when I talk about it in a minute, is thinking about posthumous interests. So there are philosophers who debate whether or not people who are dead still have rights, still have interests, still have values, whether we have obligations to people who are dead, whether we ought to respect their bodies or respect their wishes or keep promises that we made to them, things like that. So I think there's this really interesting ethical question that's still very much being debated about whether dead people have enduring interests. And one potential interest that people may have is how their ideas are used. People who engage in a lot of creativity, or creative activities, I know there are a lot of debates, for instance, among artists about how, who and for what reason they're okay with people using their art. And similar questions come up with people who with using people's ideas. There are also issues of consent that seem really difficult to get around for long dead strategists. So people who are long dead, of course, they can't give us actual valid consent for use of their intellectual resources. Maybe we can get some other kind of consent, hypothetical consent or counterfactual consent. We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes, but we can't simply go up to them and have them sign a form, right? Because the actual individual is long dead and is no longer capable of consenting to anything. And also thinking about ethics of potential for misuse. So even if you have somebody who's long dead, even if you were able to get their actual valid consent to use their resources, would they be able to understand the various things that you want to do with it? Maybe the U.S. military says, well, we want to create, a digital, an AI avatar of you now, and we're going to use it to help us win the conflict in Afghanistan. But then, 50, 100, 150 years go by and the US military decides they want to use that tactician's, that AI to put it forward towards another use. Maybe like, wiping out an indigenous population or, perpetrating an unjust war, a war of aggression against some other state. Okay, well, even if that individual consented to being digitized and having a kind of digital psychological twin of themselves created, it's not clear that they would be able to anticipate some of these future uses. And there are similar concerns about some of these some living strategists. So again, right, with living strategists, one upside is that you can get their actual valid consent. You can go to people like General Petraeus and other living generals and say to them, here's what we want to do. Do we have your consent? Can you complete the consent form? Can you give us morally valid consent to use your neural data or your particular way of thinking to kind of replicate it in a digital way and then use it to promote our strategic interests? But again, even living strategists may find it really difficult to predict how their digital selves are going to be used by the military in the distant future. So if you're consenting for the creation of an AI to, to create a digital version of you that's going to be used over the next 10 or 15 years and no longer than that, that's one thing. But if you're consenting for it to be used by the Pentagon in perpetuity, it's difficult to know how valid that person's consent. Once we get 100 years down the road, how strong is that consent? Given that they couldn't anticipate a lot of these things that have come down the road. How about in 200 years? How about in 150 or 1,000 years, 2,000 years? It's not clear that the consent is nearly as robust. And at some point, we begin to wonder, or there's a real worry that it's no longer valid consent. And of course, finally, there is this question about whether or not people have rights to their right to their neural data, or to so if I there's a lot of discussion about, like, if the military, for instance, takes brain scans of its soldiers and they discover things about the particular ways they think, or they discover something about something that has to do with their brain, something neurological, whether it's a condition or whatever, who owns that data? This is also relevant for criminal defendants. If psychologists examine criminal defendants and they find out that there's something exculpatory, maybe they have frontotemporal dementia, say, right, which would alleviate them from responsibility. Does the defendant have a right to keep that data to themselves? Do they, or does that information have to be disclosed? So there are all kinds of interesting questions about whether there are neural rights, and if we're going to create digital versions of people, how people's rights interact with the creation of digital versions. Okay, so I'm going to offer just briefly some reasons for thinking that people do have posthumous interests, which is to say that people have interests, and in particular, I'm going to focus on one interest, which is the interest in how somebody's intellectual resources are used even after their death. I think it's a given that deceased strategists, people like Napoleon and Sun Tzu, they never provided permission for an AI recreation of their minds. That would be interesting if they did, but again, they really couldn't anticipate this kind of technology, so there's every reason to think that they never provided any such permission. And if by some miracle they had given consent, it likely wasn't for unrestricted use. So even in cases where somebody a living strategist says, yes, you can digitize my my mind, and at least the strategic parts of it, so that the way I think about strategy can be kept by the Pentagon for future use. It's unlikely that they have just unrestricted use. They say use it for whatever, whenever, for whatever reason, for whatever project. Okay, so there's a philosopher named David Boonin. He wrote this really excellent book that came out in 2019 which I love David Boonin's titles. The book is called Dead Wrong: The Ethics of Posthumous Harm. And in the book, the big project of his book is that it is possible to harm, and therefore it is possible to wrong people who are dead after they're dead. So he offers an argument for this, which begins with the premise that it's possible for an agent's act to inflict unfelt harm on somebody else. If it's possible to inflict unfelt harm on someone else, then the desire satisfaction principle is true. And what the desire satisfaction principle says is that if your act frustrates somebody else's desire, then your act harms that person. Okay, so if it's possible for someone's act to inflict unfelt harm on somebody else, then that would frustrate the desire, and so it would harm them. If the desire satisfaction principle is true, then it is possible for someone's act to harm someone else, even if the act takes place after they are dead, at which point, of course, they don't feel it. And therefore, it is possible for someone's act to harm someone else, even if the act takes place after they are dead. Now, People have a variety of different reactions to David Boonen's arguments. I'm not going to ask you to agree or disagree with him. I'm just using David Boonen's argument as an example of a kind of argument that you can give to think that people who are dead, have some legitimate say or have some legitimate right or interest over how their resources get used, even after their death, including their intellectual resources. Okay. So I want to use just a hypothetical example to kind of ground our case here. So I want you to imagine, and I love how AI generated this image for me. It's a really provocative image. So I asked them to generate an image of Dwight David Eisenhower, who of course was a really brilliant strategist and tactician, but asked him to do it so that he was in Nazi uniform. So obviously, you can imagine the kind of case here where General Eisenhower, his strategic mind gets recreated by AI and it gets used by a neo-Nazi state. And they use it for fascist domination over democratic states. So one question we could ask is, well, would General Eisenhower approve of this use of his strategic mind? It seems obviously not. In fact, we have every reason to think that General Eisenhower would oppose this use of his mind. He worked very hard and risked his own life and lost a lot of friends and compatriots in the course of fighting the Nazis and in building up the US military and infrastructure to prevent anything like a Nazi state from rising again. And even in his farewell address as president, he warned about the rise of the military-industrial complex. He worried that the U.S., through its process of deep militarization during the Cold War, was potentially going to become a police state, which would lend itself to becoming a fascist state. So anyway, all that to say, we have lots of reason for thinking that General Eisenhower, formerly, and also President Eisenhower, would not approve of this particular use. Okay. All right. So some people are going to say, all right, so when it comes to these long dead people, these long dead strategists, people like Napoleon Bonaparte and Sun Tzu and Erwin Rommel, and maybe even General Eisenhower, maybe we can't get their actual consent because we can't just go up to them and ask them, hey, are you okay if we create a digital version of you that then we use to help us think through various, game theoretic problems? All right, we can't do that, but maybe we can get close enough. We can get counterfactual consent. And what counterfactual consent is essentially is predicting what a person would consent to if they were able to do so. So one common application of this is a lot of people think that counterfactual consent is really useful to think about when it comes to patients who are unconscious or incompetent. So if this person were awake, they would rather have their leg amputated than die. Or if this person were here today, they would choose to be an organ donor rather than, to opt against being an organ donor. So maybe we can, and we usually think that those kind of preferences, the fact that somebody would have agreed to do something, can be a kind of valid consent, but it's counterfactual because it's not the actual individual who's giving consent, but rather we're trying to predict what their preferences were. And you might think that AI could predict what the preferences and what these long dead strategists would have chosen based on whatever data we feed to them. Okay, but there are some limitations to this. So for one, there's an understanding gap. So think about an ancient strategist like Sun Tzu. He's not going to understand, right? He's not going to comprehend AI technology. I asked AI for this image to give me an image of Marcus Aurelius looking at, something like ChatGPT and looking very confused. So you can imagine generating an AI version of someone like Marcus Aurelius or Sun Tzu and then saying, all right, listen, we really want to know how you would advise the U.S. military to achieve strategic dominance in Afghanistan. All right, Marcus Aurelius is going to say, what's Afghanistan? What's the U.S. military? What do you mean you have flying machines, right? All of these things. Now, some people are going to say, oh, well, we can also update them, though. We can educate them educate them about the way the world is, kind of just bring them up to speed on everything that's happened since they've been alive. But this might change their strategic thinking in undesirable ways. It's not clear that you really get what Marcus Aurelius would tell you to do, or what Sun Tzu would tell you to do, rather than what somebody who thinks a fair bit like Sun Tzu or Marcus Aurelius would tell you to do. So you may end up polluting their strategic thinking. Right, you may not end up preserving the strategic thinker, and maybe that's good, and maybe that's bad. But if you actually lose something of strategic value, because if their strategic value or their strategic thinking is very much tied to how they understood the world at the time they did, then changing their understanding of the world may change the value that you get out of their recommendation or prediction. And also, I think there are some good reasons to be skeptical of counterfactual consent and whether it is really valid. So does the fact that, for instance, if I asked Jonathan Beaver right now, if I were to ask him, hey, is it okay if I go into your house and make myself a cup of coffee? Well, I know he would say yes if I asked him that. So given that he would say yes, I can just let myself into his house and make myself a cup of coffee. I don't really think in that situation that there is valid consent being given. And so I think there are reasons to worry or question the extent to which counterfactual consent really is valid consent. Okay. Now, when it comes to living strategists, I think the situation looks a little bit different. Again, some of these issues that I brought up before, concerns about neural rights, I think, are still a big portion of this, and people debate whether or not there are such things as the right to your neural data. The nation of Chile adopted a constitutional amendment several years ago, wherein they added neural rights to their federal constitution, and there are people who press for these kinds of rights. And so we can ask ethical questions if you are inclined to think that there are such things as rights to your neural data. What does it mean to have ownership of your neural data and control it? Does that mean that the person has to be alive so they can have say-so over how their AI gets used? This, of course, ties into questions about, future use of the AI, and questions about how we're going to use, like what the scope of this person's consent is. So if somebody says, I'm fine with you digitizing my mind and using it, the Pentagon digitizing my mind and using it for future purposes, but how exactly are you going to use it? Well, how much information do we really have to give them? Do we just have to give them everything we know? Because of course we're only making the decisions for now, but eventually people will replace us in the Pentagon and they will make other decisions. So lots of ethical questions concerning that. Just for the sake of time, I'm just going to move forward a little bit. So I think there are two broad things left here to talk about, which is some people are just going to suggest that all this emphasis on consent is wrong-headed, and that instead we should be looking for ways around consent. So one strategy that you could use is what's sometimes called tacit consent. So you might think that people who join the military, who voluntarily at least join the military, that they give tacit consent to the military using their strategic insights, weapons, and other key resources, at least in cases where the use of those resources is necessary for military success. So you may just think that in the same way that that people who voluntarily join the military, that we can use their bodily resources, because again, right, the idea is that if you voluntarily sign up for the military, you are surrendering your right in many ways, like to go where you please and do what you please in a lot of ways. And maybe the military has say so not only of where your body goes, but also where your mind goes and how they can use it. Another strategy would be to argue that It can be permissible to use a soldier's strategic resources, including their neural data, their brain data, even without their consent, provided that that such use is necessary to prevent some really horrible evil. So there are a number of ethicists who think that, for instance, if I need to, if a trolley's headed towards somebody, use one of these trolley cases, and I need to prevent the trolley from killing 5 people, and the only way I can do it is by, using your hand to push the button, then I'm morally allowed to use your hand to kind of press the button, say if I can't press it myself or whatever, and there's no harm to you. And so I'm allowed in that case to use your body even without your consent, because there's a lesser evil justification or even a lesser evil obligation to use you in that kind of way. And maybe there's similar obligations. So imagine you have a soldier and you say, hey, look, all of our soldiers are going to die unless you tell us your strategy to save them. And the soldier says, no, I'm not going to tell you what my strategy is to save them. Well, would it be permissible for us to, for example, put, hook that individual up to, an fMRI or something like that to read what their neural responses are and then divine their strategy from that? Would that be a violation of their rights? A lot of people, including me, are going to be sympathetic to saying, no, because it looks like that's information they should hand over. So if they don't, so since they should hand it over, there's this question of normative consent. Should they hand it over? And given that they should hand it over, what are the implications for that? Okay, again, I think this is just a little bit about thinking about how we should go about this policy-wise. So strategies that we can deploy to maintain consent and continue emphasizing it as something very important when we create these digital versions of these long dead individuals. We can create programs where people can give advanced directives for how their their mental resources can be used and for what purposes, in the same way that people talk about with their organs or other pieces of their estate, whether it's their money or particular bits of physical property and so on. We can use AI to predict strategist preferences for specific scenarios. So in cases where their wishes weren't particularly clear, maybe we can use AI to use a lot of what they've said about their broad preferences for being digitized to fill in the blanks a little bit. And of course, it seems like a very good idea to establish committees that are specifically dedicated to evaluating and approving particular uses of AI replicas. All right, forward. So just to sum up a little bit for thinking about some of the technological possibilities and then the ethical components here, I think we can all agree that generative AI is a really promising technology, and specifically, again, I think I've shown that there are lots of applications in it, from whether it comes to really obnoxious things like cheating on your papers using ChatGPT to write your papers for you, or using it to help you create some images for a PowerPoint, which seems plenty permissible, to using it to predict what patients' preferences were. And all the way down to the more specific use of replicating some of these military tacticians, so we get a sense of, we can preserve the kind of strategic knowledge that they previously provided. Additionally, it may be that there's a moral obligation to replicate and utilize strategist minds. So if you really think that, one way of thinking about it is that if you believe that there is something like a right to self-defense, and that it's a good idea to have something like a federal military, and that military should be adequately prepared and empowered to protect you, then you don't want to lose key resources that are, that would leave you vulnerable. So you don't want to lose, for instance, like at the beginning of World War II, you don't want to lose your Pacific Fleet like you did at Pearl Harbor. That really makes the population, the civilian population, more vulnerable to unjust attacks. So you want to protect the civilian fleet and preserve it and keep it in good shape. And maybe in a similar way, there's an obligation to preserve strategic knowledge and particular ways of thinking, because they can be useful in averting harm to your civilian population. But then, of course, there are various moral challenges that come up with this. I mentioned that, for instance, it may be immoral to replicate the minds of people who can't provide valid consent, or it may also be immoral to use replicated minds of living people who couldn't anticipate a particular future use of their AI replicated mind. So I think there are a lot of interesting ethical questions that are not totally resolved. I've talked about some various ways of thinking about those problems and strategizing around them. Yeah, so this is just intended to be a kind of food for thought, and I'm curious what people think about these various issues. So with that, I will stop talking and thank everybody very much. I will turn my video back on.
Mike, thank you. That was great. That was really fun. I hope we don't have too many angry remarks, but this is just the sort of topic that's new enough that there may be some. So we will see. I was taking what I try to do in the Q&A, Blake, is to try to section out the questions into buckets. And I kind of identified two types of questions for you. One is limits of use questions. And the other is something like what it looks like to model agency. And so I'm going to kind of move from the first to the second because there's quite a few questions in the agency bucket. But I thought I'd start with Camille Brickbeck, who's got a really good question for you about the limits and maybe the moral limits on the use of technologies like this. Camille, if you're still here, you can feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, I'm here. There's a pretty big thunderstorm on my side, so I may cut in and out. But yeah,
okay.
I had questions on the limits of use, like years and like for what the actual data is being used, as well as like moral limits. And I was also thinking about like the time. So like for a specific person being brought back, and what would be considered like ethically or morally okay at that time, or what they think is acceptable, versus what would be acceptable in the current time that it's being used.
Yeah, so good question. So I think this is something that ethicists have run into with the personalized patient preference predictor. So even if you account for population level preferences, say cultural preferences or religious preferences, you may still, the person that you're trying to decide a course of treatment for, they may be an outlier from that population. But it may be that certain, some of these long dead strategists, we already know right away, based on whatever their religious beliefs or cultural observances were, that they would not consent to being used either in particular ways or to being recreated in this way at all. Yeah, I think using some of those as criteria for ruling in or ruling out the recreation of particular historical people, those criteria probably are going to be restrictive in some cases, and say, no, given that this person was Hindu, or given some other philosophical belief they have, they probably would object to being recreated or used in this particular way. I mean, I would think that it would, even Dwight Eisenhower, to go back to one of the examples I talk about, would be rather mortified at the prospect of being, digitized and then used by the military industrial complex to further imperialist ends, because I think he had a real reckoning with even his own record on that towards the end of his at the end of his presidency and towards the end of his life. So yeah, I think those things are very relevant, and it's not clear exactly how many people it's going to rule in as being permissible to recreate or to digitize, but it's certainly going to rule a lot of people out.
And I also just wanted to add the curiosity. I find it interesting, and sometimes including like who's going to be at that table when they're creating this too in the future, because I think a lot of times the population that's there isn't thinking about historical events or maybe the times or morals or ethics. So having a pretty diverse and robust table when this is happening, it's just yeah. And then also taking that input with a grain of salt, because just watching that video clip you included, seeing how that could affect and how quickly someone could be stuck in that moment and maybe never kind of come out of it. Yeah, just it's interesting.
Yeah, no, I completely agree that it really matters, if we have something like an ethics advisory board, or something like an IRB to decide, okay, who are we recreating, and what are the ground rules going to be? Like, what data are we going to consult? Is social media in or is social media out as something that we can mine data from to kind of get a sense of someone's preferences? Also, other ethical questions like, what if somebody didn't really have much of a digital, like I'm thinking, for instance, of somebody like my grandmother. She doesn't really have a strong social media or digital media presence, but she does keep a private personal diary. Would it be permissible to access the contents of her private personal diary and feed that information into a generative AI if that was the only way of like creating a digital version of her? Well, some people are going to say, well, no, that violates like her right to privacy, and you shouldn't be, no one should have access to this. So I think it really matters what the rules are, and also who the stakeholders are going to be, who are going to be at the table. And I think one interesting ethical question, of course, is like, if we agree, so if we get to the point where we do create digital or AI avatars of some of these long dead people, should some of those avatars be involved in deciding what other avatars or who gets digitally recreated? Because after all, none of us who are living have ever died and then been redigitized or anything like that. So who are the relevant stakeholders? Well, maybe the closest thing we can get is, these AIs that are replicated, these duplicates, psychological twins of these people, to say, oh, well, I was dead and then I was brought back to life as an AI, and so here are the kinds of things that I think matter to me. Are those the closest we can get to stakeholders who then make decisions about who else gets resurrected? Maybe. So yeah, I think that's really interesting and insightful. Thanks for the questions.
Yeah, Blake, I want to interject with a like maybe a technical question to try to tread the line between science fiction and science fact.
Sure.
Part of that, the question I jotted down was like, do we have enough Napoleon to create a simulation? Is it enough just to take somebody's like historical figures writings and create a simulation of them, or do we need multimedia content to really get a sense of the person?
Yeah, I mean, so as a technical question, I think it wouldn't surprise. So here's one thing to consider is for somebody like Erwin Rommel, right, who didn't really keep a lot of written records of his strategies, who obviously didn't have access to things like social media, didn't write books, so on and so forth. Let's say that we, found a few letters that he wrote to some loved ones or whatever, wherein he reflected on the war and said, oh, I think, maybe he had some strategic thinking. If we can just get here, then we'll be able to achieve strategic dominance, and then the Soviets will fail, and then we're able to do that, right? Maybe some brief strategic thoughts. And so we just take those little kernels and we say, okay, this is enough to get us Erwin Rommel. I would be skeptical. But also it seems like I don't know how we would falsify it either, right? Because there's so little data not only to verify, but who really is going to come out and say, that doesn't sound like Erwin Rommel to me. Like, I don't know what the basis is. If they have such a low digital trail, it's hard to verify. It's also hard to falsify. I think you're right that the better somebody's digital trail is, the more information that there is that's available. Particularly, if we know what their voice sounded like, the more we know about their culture, the more we know about their family, about their upbringing. I'm thinking about the information that's available for, like on me. somebody could access, personality tests that I took in a psychology course as an undergrad in college, and they could use that as the basis. And then they could look at personality tests I took later on and say, oh, here's how Blake changed over time. But there's not as much information on some of these historical figures. So it does seem like it's not clear that we're really going to be able to create hyper-realistic replicas of these individuals, or to even know if we've actually achieved that. So if somebody tells me I've created a hyper-realistic chatbot of Marcus Aurelius, I might talk with it and say, I don't know, this person is as Marcus Aurelius as anyone. I've read Marcus Aurelius's meditations. This sounds like Marcus Aurelius to me, but I've also never met Marcus Aurelius. I don't know how Marcus Aurelius felt about things outside of the meditations. I've never talked to anybody who knew him. I've never read the writings of anyone who knew him. So hard for me I don't really have much to go on here.
So this was, I think this was like the heart of my technical question, right? Because if the idea is we're going to model brilliant strategic minds for military use, we're going to model something. Is it going to be a brilliant strategic mind? I think the likelihood is very, very low. I mean, the Scarlett Johansson example that came out in the news this past year was a good one, because one has access to endless hours of Scarlett Johansson saying things in film and media.
Yeah.
And so you can model her voice quite accurately to the point where she has to sue to get it taken down. Can the same be said of Aurelius or Rommel, or pick a figure? I find myself skeptical, but that's not a critique of your argument. It's just a critique of the technology per se. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So there may be limits. And also I think there's and I'll just add this very quickly, there's an extent to which we also have to ask, to what extent are some of these other factors about their cultural preferences or religious preferences, how much of this do we really need to know to capture the thing about them that we really want, which is their strategic brilliance? Because it may be intertwined with some of these other things, but in some cases it may not be. So
and I won't ask it, but Masanori in the chat just sort of spoke to this about whether the goal is modeling a specific digital twin of a real life strategist, or whether it's getting a strategist by incorporating lots of strategic views. That's a really interesting secondary question too. Go ahead, please.
Oh no, so I'm just reading the question here in detail. So creating a digital twin, developing a journey. Yeah, good. So one potential moral difference could be is that if you create a digital twin of Dwight Eisenhower, and then Dwight Eisenhower, the Eisenhower bot, is now being used by a neo-Nazi state to further its imperialist fascist aims all over the globe. And there's this, everyone's like, thank God for Eisenhower bots, because he's really going to bring about the Third Reich. I think one sort of worry you may have is that could do reputational damage to Dwight Eisenhower in a way that may violate some interest of his, whereas it may violate his interests in different ways or to a different degree than if the neo-Nazis merely learned a little bit about strategy from Eisenhower's writings or from historical accounts of his tactics and then deployed some of those. There may still be a right violation there, because Eisenhower may really say, hey, I really don't want the Nazis learning from me and using what I've done as a blueprint for how to achieve global dominance. But if you're also using things like his image or his name or his likeness, or you're saying, no, basically we have a digital twin of Dwight Eisenhower and we talked him into being a Nazi and now he's helping us, I think there's probably a lot more wronging that's going on there.
Yeah, that makes good sense. It's like a morally heavy version of using a pop song at a political rally without permission. Yeah. Steve Kubler, you had a really good question about what drives a recoil, maybe possible recoils from the idea of resurrection. Do you want to ask that one?
Yeah, I have a gut feeling. I don't know if everyone shares it, that this kind of technology that you're discussing is abhorrent in some way. I reckon a lot of people would share that, and I wonder what drives it. At one aspect, it might be a religious sense of sanctity, or it might be a non-religious but human sense of sanctity. Um, what do you think drives that? So I'm asking you to tell me, how do we understand ourselves?
I think, yeah, I think part of it is, I'm sure some of it is religious or cultural, in this sense that we have this sense that people who are dead and gone, that it's, there's something creepy or there's something disrespectful about trying to bring them back, right? That's wrong or problematic in some way. I think people also have a sense, on some level, that it's maybe psychologically unhealthy for us to go about things. So one of the interesting things about the documentary Eternal You is that there's this one psychologist they keep going back to, and she keeps saying at various points, she's like, no, I know what you're doing, but are we sure it's a good idea? Are we sure this is really healthy for people to feel like they're chatting with their long lost or their recently lost partner, loved one, whoever, to sense that they're going to get closure? Because that's a make-believe, right? This is not who the person really was. And I had a conversation about with a fellow philosopher about this, who talked about the fact that when he never came out, he's gay, and he never came out to his mom while she was still living. And we were talking about this documentary, and I said, well, what if we could create, a chat bot of your mom, really, and you told her, like, would you be interested in knowing what she said? And he's like, well, because if she says no, then I might that might feel very real, and I might feel really rejected, or I might think, oh, I don't think that's really like my mom. So some of the boundaries of like how whether what you really believe about this individual, or whether you're engaging in a kind of psychologically harmful make believe, like thinking about these individuals as real individuals. I think, yeah, I think that's also probably a significant part of it. And also people are just, I think, very skeptical. People have a lot of skepticism about AI generally. And the more AI seems self-aware and seems conscious and seems to have agency, I think that freaks people out, because we've all seen the terrible science fiction films where AI becomes self-aware and then it wipes all of us out. So I think people have real discomfort with some of these machines passing the Turing test and imitating human likeness, because they view it as something that makes us vulnerable to a kind of deception. Yeah, so I think there are a lot of things behind a lot of people's discomfort with it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, though.
We've got other good questions in the same category, but I want to shift, Blake, a little bit towards questions about agency and modeling agency. And the first of those comes from Dr. Jantz.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. It was great. I guess I want to go after agency, but also maybe even more so after metaphysics here. It seems to me what you are talking about presumes a certain kind of theory of personal identity over time, or of personhood in particular. And I guess I'd characterize it as an internalist sort of concept of the person. In other words, who we are is what is inside of us. And the task then for AI is to recover some of that using whatever means available in order to recreate that kind of internal representation. And it's worth noting, I suppose, that there are approaches to personhood that don't start from that internalist model. So I'm thinking we do a lot of work in African philosophy. So Ubuntu, for example, is what we would call an externalist model, where relation and the community is far more important than what's inside of you. And so it seems to me that changes the question entirely, and it may even change it for AI, which is what does it mean to recreate that person? Well, the person is already recreated. After the person is gone, who the person was is maintained within the relations in the community. And so if you want to remodel that, you already have the data to do that. You don't have to go inside. And so I'm wondering if we think of personhood differently, if we then also need to think of AI differently. And I'm wondering also if this extends to our notions of cognition. I think we have, in what you've been talking about, it's a fairly kind of computationalist version of cognition. Well, there's 4E cognition now. There's enactivism, which is also a kind of interactive relational notion of cognition. It's embodied, all of those sorts of things. And so there too, I'm wondering if we change our view of cognition, does that change how we need to think about AI?
These are great questions. Thanks. So this is the part where I'm going to avoid the temptation to pretend to be a metaphysician, and instead say that I think there is a version of these ethical concerns where you think that this generative AI, these chat bots, right, that they are persons, or that they are person-like, or in a kind of full and robust sense. And so that you really have recreated the individual in some kind of way. There may be even some theories of personal identity, psychological continuity theories. It's like, oh, this person dies and then the AI wakes up with all the same memories and so on. And so it just is that person, actually. You haven't recreated them. You've just brought them back to life. And it's not distinct from the individual. I don't even know that you really need to take... I don't think you need to take strong views like that to think that there may be some ethical concerns here of thinking, well, there was a particular way that this individual thought about things based on things they wrote, based on things they posted on social media, based on interviews they gave, based on data gathered from family members or colleagues. If you are going to use those kind of intellectual resources from them, there may be ethical limits about how you use them, or whether you get to use them at all if they really do belong to them. One of my favorite papers in philosophy is this paper that was written by David Lewis called Divine Evil. And David Lewis, I think, died in 2005 or 2006 or so. And he had outlined this paper called Divine Evil, but he never got to finish it. It was really just a kind of rough sketch, and he talked through some of the arguments. Well, a philosopher friend of his, after he died, he said, I really think David Lewis's papers, this idea for a paper, is a really great paper. So he wrote up the full paper, and it was published under David Lewis's name. And I remember thinking, like, I'm a fan of David Lewis. I think he was a brilliant philosopher, brilliant metaphysician. And I think a lot of the stuff that's in this paper really reflects the things that he probably would have wanted to say. But the way that it gets said, and particular commitments, as you're kind of trying to round out the basic argument, and you say, well, let's make some provisional assumptions, or here, well, I need this sub-argument to support this secondary premise, or whatever. I think it's fair to wonder, like, did David Lewis is he really the author of those things? Do they really reflect his agency? And I'm like, I don't know, but I think if we're going to put his name on it and represent it as his thoughts, then there may be really serious again, ethical restraints about again, attributing things to him. And it's interesting because at the end of that paper in particular, there's an acknowledgement section, and it said, the person said, I was a good friend of David Lewis's, and I ask that the reader attribute all of the deficiencies of this paper to me and all of the insights to David Lewis. And I'm like, that's very nice. But again, right, like, I don't know that the attribution game is really that straightforward. Like, if it's good, it's Lewis. If it's bad, it's you. Right. Like, so I think if we're going to say that these are David Lewis's ideas and these are the particular things that he would claim, then yeah, we probably do have various obligations surrounding attributions of that sort, or use of those intellectual resources. And this is one of the reasons I brought up neural rights. So like if I think about philosophy in a particular way, and let's say a neuroscientist studies how I think about ethics, and then they take that and they kind of measure my neural patterns over time, and they're like, okay, here's how Blake thinks about ethics, and it follows this very particular unique code. Well, suppose somebody else like thinks in a very similar way to the way I do. I know philosophers who think more similarly and some who think more dissimilarly. Do I have some kind of right to a particular pattern of a way of thinking? Also, my pattern of thinking changes based on whether or not I'm taking Ritalin or not for ADHD, right? So does the pharmaceutical company then have some say over like the neural pattern and the right? I mean, I think these are really interesting questions about whether they can be multiply instantiated in different individuals, and what it would mean to have a right over your neural data or a particular kind of thought or a way of thinking. So I think those questions are very much operating in the background here. And it may just be that if people don't have rights to these kind of particular bits of information or whatever, but rather they just have a right against people attributing things to them that they would have found objectionable, or attributing things to them without their consent, saying, well, I bet Dwight Eisenhower would have been on the side of the neo-Nazi state if he were here to make that decision. Maybe they just have rights against that and not rights to like the particular bits of strategic information. If Napoleon comes up with some brilliant strategy for defeating the Prussian cavalry, maybe he doesn't, it's not like he owns that information just because he's the first one who thought of it. So I think these questions may take some priority, but I think even if you can still think that there are interesting ethical questions here, even if you have a very metaphysically thin, view of like, I just have to make some weak assumptions about thinking that like maybe these aren't the persons. Maybe there's, you don't have to assume in particular thesis about personal identity to think that these are people's intellectual resources, or these are things that are being attributed to them, to their characters, to their preferences, and those matter morally, whether or not the AI, the generative AI, actually is the person.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's so interesting.
Like your thinking had me, I've got a question for you. I've been, especially out of the Project December example, then you've got me thinking a lot about the potential for, let's call it emotional displacement, right? So this had always been a concern, maybe with the early days of dating chatbots and whatever. But now we've got these AR interactions with deceased loved ones recreated in a virtual reality space. Like, is there a risk? It's a harder example for me to nail down in terms of the military strategists, but is there a sense that we could forget or emotionally displace? And do you see any potential risks there? I know that's beyond the scope of your argument.
No. Can you tell me more about what you mean by emotionally displaced? Like, who's being emotionally displaced?
Yeah.
And what is emotional displacement in this context?
Yeah, and I guess my response is going to show some of my sort of personal ethic cards, but
that's fine.
I've got a pretty strong sense that like there's a distinct difference between relating interpersonally, and Steve and I have this conversation about Center for Ethics events all the time. There's a difference between interpersonal relations embodied by Zoom, and then displaced, right? Like through myself to some virtual recreated simulated entity. And like there's a distinct sort of hierarchy of relations there for me. And so by emotional displacement, I mean we're spending our emotional energy relating to this thing that can't relate back.
Yes. I think I mean, you're right that some of the uses of generative AI are relational in this way. People want to engage with the chatbots. People want those, these generative AI to be paired with virtual reality or augmented reality so that they can feel like they're engaging with their loved ones. Other times it's very emotionally detached in the sense that we really just want to phrase it very crassly, take this individual's abilities and strip them for parts, right? And I think there's a real worry that, well, one sort of worry there is that if you really just view someone's way of thinking about something as kind of incidental to them, and it's like you can take these things piecemeal away from them. Again, I think there are reasons to be skeptical about how much a lot of these ways of thinking about religion, say, versus thinking about tactics, like to assume that they have nothing to do with one another, that we can just take Napoleon and make him, sort of culturally a 21st century North American, and that all of his strategic thinking will be exactly the same. I think there are reasons for being skeptical of that. I think there are also good reasons for being ethically skeptical of some view that says like, well, it's okay to take this whole robust, individual and just kind of mine them for resources in this way. But again, I can also see somebody pushing back and saying, well, we do this kind of thing anyway, right? Like, I mean, my students aren't always interested in like how I feel about my dogs or what my favorite foods are or whatever. They want to know what I think about particular cases in medical ethics. When I, like I'm here today talking about ethics, most people here, probably don't care at all about, how much I like falafel or what my views in epistemology are, am I like, and that seems fine, right, for people to care about that in one way or another. And so maybe to create generative AI that just replicates one part of a person, maybe it's not problematic, but maybe it is. I don't have super clear intuitions about that.
That's fair. That's fair. I think this, for me, is one of the most interesting areas in the AI space. Like, yeah, it comes back to sort of Bruce's position on whether we're constituted by our full set of relationships or whether we can be, as you say, sort of pieced out. I'd like to turn the last question over to Steve Kubler, who had a really good question about the sort of practical implications. Steve, if you want to close us out with that, would be great.
Yeah, I'm very much aligned with you, Dr. Hereth, about this being an exciting topic, and the academic in me loves to explore this space. At the same time, I tend to be very practical. Riding into work today, I was listening to NPR, and the pundits were going off about tonight's presidential debate, and what does Trump need to do? What does Harris need to do? And they made the point Harris needs to speak to the common person, that most voters care about their microcosm, not the macrocosm. So don't tell them about GDP, tell them about inflation.
Right.
We need to be concerned as creators, whether we're academics or not, about how it's relevant. And I see the relevance, but I wonder if you could highlight what are the relevant takeaways, because some might hear this and say, well, this is just fluffy ivory tower stuff. And yet I don't think so. I think there's something really significant here. So, for my mom back in Kentucky, what is the real takeaway, especially given that the AI ain't there just yet?
I think that's a great question. I think maybe one important takeaway is that we just want to think very carefully about, and this is something I would want to think about and probably articulate better if I had more time to think about it. But one thing I think is that we're increasingly relying on AI to give us insights into people's preferences and who they really are, including insights into ourselves. And I think we have good reason to be cautious in thinking about like whether this is really something that we want to do, whether AI is really as reliable in this kind of way, and whether or not the kind of judgments that AI gives us about what people's preferences would be or what they would decide under certain situations, even if they are really reliable and do give us insight, if that is the way that we really want to go about making decisions from people, as opposed to this more like interpersonal or familial or emotive way of thinking about other people. The other kind of practical takeaway, I think, is that various militaries around the world are developing and beginning to implement these technologies. And I will also say that I was approached to be one of the ethicists for a DARPA project that concerned generative AI. And one of the things they told me is they said, well, we want to train this large language model to mimic your ethical thinking and the ethical thinking of a bunch of other people to see if we can get a hyper realistic kind of consensus driven chatbot that can give, very thought out kind of ethical advice to battlefield operators that, of course, it's not like ethics is going to be the main focus necessarily, but it may be that people want to rely on these kind of ethics bots to, is it okay to secure this hill? Is this a just war? Let's consult the chat bot because it's like the consensus of, I think of that paper like Assisted Suicide, the Philosopher's Brief, where it's like Robert Nozick and John Rawls and Judy Thompson and Ronald Dworkin and all of the who's who of these big political philosophers and ethicists who don't agree with one another about hardly anything, but they all agree with one another about assisted suicide. And so there's like this convergence argument that like everybody who disagrees about everything else agrees on this one thing, and that's a good reason to go with it. And so what if you input the ethical thinking of all these different ethicists and they all get in there and they say, this is a just war, go ahead and fight it. And what if you use this for tacticians, not just to think about ethics, but to think about tactics on the battlefield? Should we be trusting those judgments? At the very least, the US military is continuing to experiment with and plans on utilizing these technologies. So we need an ethics that moves at the speed of science and technology. We don't currently have that. So I think one of the practical takeaways is we better think about the ethics of it sooner rather than later, because the military is going to conduct this research and find applications for it.
That's really helpful. It makes perfect sense to me. And I think the consumer applications that you talked about, as well as the military applications, are very poignant. And it makes me think the lack of understanding that we have about the mind itself, harkening back to Dr. Jance's question, really tells me we need to understand ourselves in parallel with thinking about how to apply a technology that ostensibly is going to mimic ourselves. We don't understand how the brain and the mind work. So it points us back to both the sciences and the humanities. So I really appreciate those comments. Thank you.
Thank you
so much. Yeah, this was really fun. I'll turn things back over to Steve to close this out.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, thank you, Dr. Hereth, for helping us think about just how far we could go with AI and the ethics of creating chatbot personalities. And I'd like to thank Dr. Beaver for moderating our discussion and Dr. Kissel for inviting our speaker. Last but not least, thank you all of our participants for great questions and fantastic engagement. A recording of this presentation will be made available on the UCF Center for Ethics website, so you can view it again and share it with others. And there you'll find links to past talks and information on upcoming presentations in Ethically Speaking. So now I'd like to tell you about our next event, and hopefully this time I'll successfully share screen. Let me know if you can see it. All right, so AI is rapidly moving into all aspects of society, especially in the workplace. The BBC reported that an IBM survey in late 2023 showed 42% of companies were already using AI to screen recruits. Yet we know that AI tools are only as good as their training, and they can propagate built-in bias. So Dr. Mark Chong will take us through this topic in his talk on October 8th entitled, "Someone Else Got the Job, AI for Hiring and Its Biases." Dr. Chong is Associate Director of the Center for AI and Digital Ethics at the University of Melbourne, Australia. He'll be joining us from way down under with a significant time difference. So this event will begin at 6 p.m. Eastern. I hope you'll visit the UCF Center for Ethics webpage right after this event so you can register for the event. Ethically Speaking is made possible with support from the National Science Foundation and the many UCF partners that you see listed on this slide. I'd like to thank them all for helping bring this series to you. Lastly, thank you for your participation. I hope you'll share upcoming events with all of your friends and within your network so we have more participation and engagement. We really hope to see you at future presentations in Ethically Speaking, and thank you very much.